The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under the blazing sun. Harold Mitchell, 76, walked steadily down the empty road, his weathered hand gripping Teddy's leash. Teddy, a German shepherd with sharp, alert eyes, moved beside him like a soldier on patrol. Harold had seen enough of life to crave peace, but Teddy wasn't just a companion. He was protection. A former military service dog, Teddy had instincts sharper than Harold's, and both had learned to trust each other in a world that offered little else. The distant rumble of engines shattered the silence. Harold stopped, turning toward the horizon as 5 motorcycles emerged in a cloud of dust. Teddy's ears perked, his body tensing. The bikers circled Harold and Teddy, their tattoos, leather vests, and smirks painting a clear picture. The leader, a burly man with scars on his face, dismounted, his gaze landing on Teddy. "Nice dog, old man," he sneered. "Hand him over, and no one gets hurt." Harold stayed calm, though his heart pounded. "We're just passing through. Leave us be," he said. The leader smirked. "You don't seem to get it." "I wasn't asking," Teddy growled, stepping forward. Harold dropped the leash. In an instant, Teddy lunged, slamming one biker to the ground as chaos erupted. The others froze, stunned by the dog's precision. Teddy returned to Harold, standing guard. "He's trained to protect. And I've got nothing to lose," Harold said, his voice cold. The sound of distant sirens cut through the tension. The leader cursed. "Let's go," he shouted, and the gang roared off. As silence returned, Harold looked down at Teddy, stroking his fur. "Good boy, but this isn't over," he murmured. They walked on, the desert vast and quiet once more, but Harold knew their peace had been broken. The air was still, but Harold's mind churned with unease. He and Teddy continued down the lonely stretch of road, their shadows stretching long in the setting sun. Harold couldn't shake the image of the bikers' faces, the greed in their eyes, the hesitation when Teddy attacked, and the anger in their retreat. He knew men like that didn't let things go easily. They were the kind who came back, and when they did, they came back worse. Teddy, as always, walked beside him with unwavering vigilance, his ears twitching at every faint sound. Harold glanced at him. "We're not out of this yet, boy," he muttered. "Not by a long shot." Several miles down the road, Harold spotted a gas station on the horizon. It was the first sign of civilization in hours. A worn-out building with flickering neon lights and a single pickup truck parked out front. He hesitated, knowing stopping would slow them down, but Teddy needed water, and Harold needed to think. As they approached, the station attendant, a wiry young man with a baseball cap pulled low, stepped out and eyed them suspiciously. "Need something, old-timer?" the attendant asked, his tone unfriendly. Harold ignored the attitude and gestured toward the water spigot near the building. "Just need some water for my dog." The attendant shrugged and stepped aside, but as Harold filled Teddy's bowl, a low rumble reached his ears. He froze, his hand tightening instinctively on Teddy's leash. The sound was unmistakable: motorcycles. Harold's head snapped toward the horizon. The sun was dipping low, casting the desert in a golden haze, but in the distance, he saw the silhouettes of approaching bikes. 5 of them. His heart sank as the realization hit. They'd found him. The bikers hadn't given up. They'd only regrouped. Teddy stood at attention, his body tense, his sharp eyes fixed on the growing threat. Harold grabbed the bowl and straightened up, his voice calm but firm. "Stay close, Teddy. This isn't over." As the motorcycles drew closer, the attendant's face paled. "You bring trouble with you?" he asked, already backing toward the door. Harold didn't respond. Instead, he stepped away from the building, putting himself and Teddy in the open. He wasn't about to let the bikers corner him. The roar of engines grew deafening as the gang skidded to a stop in the gas station lot, their leader's expression hard with fury. The man dismounted, pulling off his sunglasses and glaring at Harold. "You think you can embarrass me and just walk away?" he growled. Harold stood firm, his hand brushing over Teddy's head. The dog growled low, ready for whatever was coming. Harold's voice was steady, though his pulse raced. You made your choice when you came after us. Let's see if you're ready for the consequences." The leader smirked, pulling something from his pocket, a switchblade that glinted in the fading sunlight. The gang spread out, encircling Harold and Teddy like predators closing in on their prey. Harold's grip tightened on the leash. Teddy crouched slightly, his muscles coiling like a spring. The fight was coming, and Harold knew there was no running from it. The leader stepped closer, his posture radiating menace, as the other bikers tightened their circle around Harold and Teddy. The setting sun bathed the gas station lot in an eerie orange glow, but Harold's focus remained sharp. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Teddy stood at his side, ears forward, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring, ready to defend. The air between the two groups felt like it could snap at any second. "You're outnumbered, old man," the leader said, his voice a low growl. "This doesn't need to get ugly. Just hand over the dog." Harold's jaw tightened, but he didn't show fear. Instead, he locked eyes with the leader, speaking calmly but firmly. "You've already made it ugly by coming after us. Turn around while you still can." The leader scoffed, glancing over his shoulder at his men. "This guy thinks he's a hero. Listen, old-timer, I'm not walking away empty-handed." Harold didn't respond. Instead, he crouched slightly and touched Teddy's collar, giving the dog a reassuring pat. The signal was subtle, but it was enough. Teddy let out a deep, rumbling growl that reverberated through the still air, a clear warning. The bikers hesitated, shifting uneasily. For the first time, doubt flickered across the leader's face. The silence was shattered by the sudden arrival of headlights sweeping across the lot. A car pulled in, and the station attendant, still hiding behind the glass door, visibly relaxed. A young couple stepped out, chatting casually, oblivious to the tension. The bikers immediately straightened, masking their aggression with forced indifference. The leader cursed under his breath, throwing Harold a dark look before signaling to his crew. "This isn't over," he muttered. The roar of their engines filled the air as the bikers mounted their motorcycles and sped off into the fading light, leaving behind a haze of dust and the lingering weight of a threat unspoken. Harold didn't move until the sound of the bikes had completely faded. Only then did he let out a slow breath and kneel beside Teddy, scratching behind the dog's ears. "They'll be back," Harold said quietly. Teddy tilted his head, his intelligent eyes meeting Harold's, as if he understood. The attendant cautiously stepped outside, his face pale. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. Harold stood, his back straight despite the years etched into his frame. "We're fine. For now," he replied. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Harold and Teddy resumed their journey, the weight of the encounter heavy on Harold's mind. He didn't know when the bikers would return, but he knew one thing for certain: they would. And next time, they'd be ready for a fight. The desert night had fallen quickly, enveloping Harold and Teddy in a blanket of darkness. The stars were sharp and bright above them, but the road ahead felt lonelier than ever. Harold's boots crunched softly against the dirt shoulder of the highway as Teddy padded silently beside him. The earlier confrontation replayed in Harold's mind like a broken record. He'd seen enough in his life to know that men like the bikers didn't back down. They had been embarrassed, humiliated even, and Harold knew they wouldn't let it go. After walking a few more miles, Harold spotted the faint glow of a small diner up ahead, its neon sign blinking unevenly in the distance. The warm light spilling from the windows offered a brief sense of comfort. He decided to stop, not because he was tired, though he was, but because he needed to think, and he knew Teddy needed a break. The bell above the door jingled as Harold pushed it open, and a few scattered patrons looked up briefly before returning to their meals. A waitress behind the counter smiled politely. Harold found a seat near the window, where he could keep an eye on the road. Teddy lay down beside him, his head resting on his paws, though his sharp eyes never stopped scanning the room. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached with a notepad. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please. And some water for my dog," Harold replied, his voice low but steady. As the waitress returned with the coffee and a bowl of water for Teddy, Harold felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He pulled it out, frowning. It was a number he didn't recognize. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. "Hello." There was silence on the other end, followed by the faint sound of breathing. Then, a voice. Deep, cold, and unmistakably familiar. "Thought you'd gotten away, didn't you, old man?" Harold's grip on the phone tightened. It was the leader of the bikers. "I told you this wasn't over," the voice continued, a sinister edge to his words. "You and that mutt of yours better watch your backs. We're coming for you." The line went dead. Harold lowered the phone slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Teddy must have sensed his tension because he lifted his head and let out a low growl. Harold reached down to pat the dog's head, his mind racing. They weren't safe, not here, not anywhere. Harold stood abruptly, tossing some cash on the table. The waitress looked up, startled. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Thanks for the coffee," Harold said curtly. Then, looking down at Teddy, he added, "Come on, boy, we've got to move." As they stepped back into the cool desert night, Harold's instincts kicked into high gear. He didn't know where the bikers were or when they'd strike, but he knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and Harold wasn't about to let that happen. The chill of the desert night was a stark contrast to the blistering heat of the day. Harold and Teddy moved briskly along the shoulder of the empty highway, the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet the only sound breaking the silence. Harold's thoughts raced as he replayed the biker leader's ominous words over and over in his mind. He had dealt with threats before, both on the battlefield and in life, but this one felt different. These men weren't just looking to scare him. They wanted revenge, and Harold knew how far desperate men were willing to go. In the distance, the faint hum of an engine made Harold freeze. His hand instinctively went to Teddy's collar as he turned his gaze toward the horizon. A pair of headlights appeared, growing larger as a vehicle approached. For a moment, Harold's pulse quickened. Was it them? Had the bikers already found him again? Teddy's ears perked up, his body tense, ready to react. Harold stepped off the road, pulling Teddy with him, and they crouched low behind a cluster of scrub brush, the darkness cloaking them. The vehicle slowed as it neared, its headlights sweeping the empty road. Harold's heart pounded in his chest, his mind running through every possible scenario. But as the car passed, its shape became clear. It was just a small pickup truck, its engine humming steadily as it disappeared into the night. Harold let out a slow breath, but the moment left him rattled. Every sound, every light, every movement now felt like a potential threat. "They'll find us sooner or later," Harold muttered under his breath, glancing down at Teddy. The dog's sharp eyes stared back at him, unblinking, as if to say, "Then we'll be ready." Harold patted his head. "Let's keep moving." They pressed on, but the weight of the situation lingered heavily in Harold's mind. He needed to think ahead. He couldn't just keep walking endlessly, waiting for the bikers to catch up. He needed to plan, to find shelter, or at least a place to make a stand if it came to that. As the road stretched on, Harold's eyes scanned the horizon for anything. An abandoned building, a rest stop, anything that could provide an advantage. In the distance, he spotted a sign. Miller's Canyon, 5 miles. It wasn't much, but it was something. Harold tightened his grip on Teddy's leash and quickened his pace. If trouble was coming, he wasn't going to face it unprepared. The road to Miller's Canyon was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from Harold's steady footsteps and the soft panting of Teddy by his side. The canyon wasn't much, a narrow stretch of rocky terrain with high walls on either side, but Harold knew it could work to his advantage. If the bikers caught up to him here, the confined space could limit their movements and give him and Teddy a fighting chance. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the wide-open desert where there was nowhere to hide. As they approached the entrance to the canyon, Harold paused and scanned the area carefully. Moonlight illuminated the jagged walls, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to shift with every passing breeze. Teddy's ears twitched, his nose testing the air. Harold crouched and placed a steady hand on the dog's head. "Anything, boy?" he whispered. Teddy didn't growl or bark, but the way his body stiffened told Harold everything he needed to know. Someone was coming. Harold's stomach tightened. He didn't have much time. His eyes darted around the canyon, looking for anything he could use. Near the base of the rocky wall, he spotted a cluster of loose stones and fallen branches. It wasn't much, but with some quick thinking, he could set up a rudimentary defense. Harold moved quickly, stacking rocks along the narrowest part of the path to create a small barricade. He arranged the branches across the ground, hoping they might at least trip up anyone approaching too fast. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. As he worked, he couldn't help but glance back down the road, half expecting to see the glow of headlights at any moment. "We've faced worse, Teddy," Harold said, more to himself than the dog. "We'll get through this." No sooner had he finished than the faint hum of engines reached his ears, growing louder with every passing second. Harold stood and backed into the shadows, pulling Teddy with him. He crouched low behind the barricade, his heart pounding in his chest. The bikers were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Teddy's growl was barely audible, a low, steady rumble that sent a chill through Harold. He whispered, his voice steady but tense, "Stay sharp, boy. It's about to start." The roar of motorcycles echoed through the canyon as the gang arrived, their headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. The leader was at the front, his injured arm bandaged but his eyes burning with rage. Harold gritted his teeth as he watched the group slow their bikes, scanning the area like predators searching for prey. The leader dismounted and called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You think you can hide, old man? This ends tonight." Harold didn't respond. Instead, he steadied himself, his hand resting on Teddy's back. The bikers didn't know it yet, but Harold had no intention of running. Not anymore. The leader's voice echoed through the canyon like a thunderclap, bouncing off the jagged walls and slicing through the stillness of the night. Harold crouched low behind his makeshift barricade, his hand resting firmly on Teddy's back. The dog's growl remained steady, low and deliberate, a warning to anyone foolish enough to cross him. The bikers dismounted their motorcycles one by one, their boots crunching against the gravel as they fanned out. Their flashlights scanned the canyon, beams of light slicing through the shadows. "You made a big mistake messing with us," the leader shouted, his voice laced with venom. "We're taking the dog, old man, and this time, there's no one around to save you." Harold's grip tightened on a rock he had picked up from his barricade. His breathing was steady, but his pulse was racing. He couldn't afford to let fear cloud his judgment. These men were angry, but anger made them sloppy. Harold had faced worse odds in his life, and he wasn't about to let a group of thugs take away the only thing that mattered to him. "You're on my ground now," Harold muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. "And I'm not backing down." The first biker stepped forward, his flashlight beam catching the edge of Harold's barricade. He laughed mockingly, kicking one of the rocks aside. "What's this? You building a fort, Grandpa?" That was all Harold needed. With a swift motion, he hurled the rock straight at the man's flashlight. The beam shattered, plunging the biker into darkness. Startled, the man stumbled back, cursing loudly. Before anyone else could react, Teddy sprang into action. Like a shadow, he darted out from behind the barricade, his movements swift and precise. He lunged at the biker, knocking him to the ground with a single powerful motion. The man screamed as Teddy's growl echoed through the canyon, his sharp teeth clamping down just enough to hold him in place. The sudden chaos sent the remaining bikers into a frenzy. Flashlights whipped around, beams darting wildly as the men tried to locate Harold and Teddy in the darkness. The leader barked orders, his voice cutting through the confusion. "Get the dog! Don't let him take us down one by one." Harold stepped out of the shadows, his figure silhouetted against the faint moonlight. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the canyon. "You should have walked away when you had the chance." The bikers froze for a moment, their confidence faltering as they realized Harold wasn't running, wasn't afraid. But their hesitation didn't last long. Another man charged toward Harold, a flashlight in one hand and a metal pipe in the other. Teddy, responding to Harold's sharp whistle, released his first target and leapt toward the new threat. his body a blur of controlled aggression. The fight was only beginning, and Harold knew he'd have to rely on every ounce of experience and resolve he had. The canyon walls echoed with shouts, growls, and the sharp sound of boots scraping against gravel. Harold stood firm, his mind focused on one goal: protecting Teddy and himself, no matter the cost. The canyon was filled with tension as Harold and Teddy braced themselves. The bikers began spreading out, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Harold stayed low behind his makeshift barricade, keeping a firm grip on Teddy's collar. The dog was silent but alert, his body coiled like a spring. Harold's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the canyon walls for anything that could give him an advantage. One biker stepped closer, kicking at the loose rocks Harold had stacked. "What's this supposed to be? A fort?" he said with a mocking laugh. Harold didn't respond. Instead, he carefully turned on his small flashlight and aimed it at the biker's face, blinding him momentarily. Startled, the man stumbled back, and Teddy immediately moved into position, standing tall and rigid in front of Harold. The dog let out a low growl, enough to make the biker hesitate. Harold's voice was calm but firm. "Turn back. You don't want to push this any further." The leader, still holding his injured arm, stepped forward, frustration clear on his face. "You're outnumbered, old man. That dog isn't going to save you." Just as the tension seemed to peak, a faint sound broke through the air, the unmistakable wail of approaching sirens. The bikers froze, their heads snapping toward the canyon entrance. Panic began to set in as the sirens grew louder, their flashing lights now visible on the canyon walls. The leader cursed under his breath, throwing Harold a furious glare. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice filled with anger. One by one, the bikers retreated, jumping onto their motorcycles and speeding off into the night. Harold stayed still, his eyes fixed on the canyon entrance until the patrol car arrived. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the area, revealing the scattered rocks and dust left behind by the gang. Harold knelt beside Teddy, running a hand over the dog's head. "Good boy," he murmured, but he knew this wasn't the end. The leader's final words echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder that the danger wasn't truly gone. Harold sat on a weathered bench outside the sheriff's small office, his gaze fixed on the horizon as dawn began to break. The events of the night replayed in his mind, every detail sharp and clear. Teddy lay at his feet, his ears twitching occasionally at the faint sounds of the waking town. The sheriff, a stout man in his late 50s, stepped outside, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He approached Harold, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "So, let me get this straight," the sheriff began, lowering himself onto the bench beside Harold. "You're saying a gang of bikers is after you? And your dog?" Harold nodded, his voice calm but firm. "They're not just any bikers. These men don't take humiliation lightly. They'll come back, and when they do, they'll come harder." The sheriff frowned, sipping his coffee. He glanced down at Teddy, who seemed almost too calm for a dog that had been in a fight hours earlier. "And this dog of yours? He's trained, isn't he? Military?" Harold didn't answer immediately, but the look in his eyes said enough. The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, we'll keep an eye out. But this town's quiet, always has been. Trouble like this doesn't belong here." Harold gave a small, humorless laugh. Trouble doesn't ask for permission. As the sheriff stood to head back inside, Harold glanced down at Teddy. The dog's sharp eyes scanned their surroundings, always alert. Harold reached down, scratching behind his ears. "We need to be ready, boy. They'll come back, and next time it won't be just threats." Later that day, Harold walked through the outskirts of town, searching for supplies. His military instincts kicked in as he evaluated every potential escape route, every vantage point. He stopped by a hardware store and picked up a few items: rope, nails, and a sturdy flashlight. He knew that if it came to another fight, he couldn't rely solely on Teddy's skills. They would need every advantage they could get. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, Harold returned to the edge of town, settling into a small, abandoned lot with a clear view of the main road. He crouched down beside Teddy, placing a hand on the dog's back. The wind had shifted, carrying with it a faint smell of oil and exhaust. Harold's stomach tightened. It was a scent he recognized too well. "They're coming, Teddy," he murmured. "We don't have much time." The two stayed there in silence, the air heavy with anticipation. Harold knew the fight ahead would test both of them in ways they hadn't been tested in years. And as the faint rumble of engines began to echo in the distance, he whispered softly, "Let's finish this." The low rumble of motorcycles filled the night, growing louder as the gang closed in on Harold and Teddy. The old lot was bathed in moonlight, but the headlights from the approaching bikes cast long, sharp shadows against the broken cars and scattered debris. Harold stood behind the rusted frame of an abandoned truck, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Teddy was beside him, silent and still, his gaze locked on the sound of their enemies. Harold placed a hand on the dog's back, whispering calmly, "It's time, boy. Let's finish this." The bikers rolled into the lot, their engines roaring as they formed a menacing line. The leader dismounted first, his bandaged arm a bitter reminder of his earlier defeat. His flashlight swept the area as he barked orders to his crew. "All right, old man. Enough hiding. We know you're here." Harold stepped out slowly, his silhouette illuminated by the harsh beams of their lights. Teddy walked at his side, his posture rigid, his sharp eyes scanning each of the bikers. The leader grinned maliciously, pointing at Harold. "You've got guts, but this is where it ends. Hand over the dog, or things get real ugly." Harold met the man's gaze, calm but unyielding. "You should have walked away the first time. You're not getting this dog, and you're not getting me." The leader's grin faded, replaced by a snarl. He motioned for his men to move forward, but before they could close in, Harold gave the signal. "Teddy, go!" Teddy shot forward like a lightning bolt, his speed and precision throwing the bikers into chaos. One man stumbled backward as Teddy growled, forcing him to the ground. Another biker hesitated, startled by the ferocity of the dog. Harold moved quickly, grabbing a piece of pipe from the ground and using it to hold off anyone who got too close. The bikers, once so confident, now scrambled to retreat, the sound of their leader's shouts drowned out by the confusion. The leader, clutching his injured arm, glared at Harold as he stumbled back to his bike. His pride was wounded, but his anger burned bright. "This isn't over," he spat, revving his engine. Harold stood tall, his hand resting on Teddy's head as the gang roared off into the night. The quiet that followed was almost deafening. Harold knelt down beside Teddy, stroking the dog's fur and murmuring softly, "Good boy, we did it." As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Harold rose, his gaze fixed on the empty road ahead. For the first time in days, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Together, he and Teddy had faced the worst, and won. And that's the end of this touching story. Before we wrap up, how about showing your support with a super sticker? It's super easy and helps the channel keep bringing you more stories like this one. Just click the dollar symbol in the chat and pick your favorite sticker. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.